Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to tell you all a little bit about the work that I've been doing over the last 2 years or so as a master's student in the Coastal Science and Policy program. My name is Hallie Brown, and my work has focused on advancing Indigenous-led coastal stewardship in California, primarily through aquaculture. Stewardship, if you're not familiar with the term, is just a slightly broader word for ecosystem management, and in this context is grounded in Indigenous practices and knowledge. So just a little of my story of how I ended up in a CSP program and working on this issue. I grew up in Santa Cruz, and growing up, I loved being outside, and I became really interested in human-environment relationships. As an undergraduate environmental studies major, I studied abroad in southern Chile. And from this experience, I decided that I wanted to dedicate my career to centering environmental and social justice and conservation, specifically through supporting tribes and indigenous communities. After graduating, I worked for 1 year as an AmeriCorps in Kodiak, Alaska, for a tribal health nonprofit. I gained experience working on a variety of environmental projects, all driven by tribal priorities, and I was introduced to working with shellfish and to aquaculture. I have now been working to apply these experiences to California, to the coast that means so much to me. Before I get into the work that I've been doing, I want to acknowledge that the land that I live on and that UCSC occupies is the unceded land of the Awaswas-speaking UP tribe. Up here, I have the land acknowledgement that UCSC co-wrote with the Amamutsun tribal band, who are the local tribe who are now stewarding the lands of the Awaswas-speaking UP. We say this land acknowledgement a lot, but I want to dive a little more into what it means and why the Amamutsun are now stewarding these lands, because it is actually very connected to why I'm doing the work I'm doing. If you've ever heard Chairman Lopez of the Amamutsun tribal band speak, he sometimes speaks to this. The Amamutsun's traditional lands are around Elkhorn Slough, Watsonville, and Hollister. And because of the impact of settler colonialism on California Native Americans, including the mission system and the US government, and the extent to which settlers tried to erase California Native Americans and their stewardship practices, the Amamutsun have taken over stewardship of this territory and are working to restore traditional stewardship practices to these lands and heal from historical trauma. And this is really the problem that I'm working to address. Settler colonialism drastically transformed human relationships with ecosystems in California. Settler colonialism violently killed and displaced indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories that they have stewarded since time immemorial. At the same time, settlers changed the ecology of California as they replaced indigenous forms of stewardship with European forms of ecosystem management, such as fire suppression and dams. In many cases, this has led to biodiversity loss and the degradation of ecosystems, and it has also prevented indigenous peoples from accessing their ancestral territories and foods, and has prevented the practice of indigenous science, which holds thousands of years of knowledge for how to steward ecosystems for sustainability and resilience. In California today, tribes own just a small fraction of their ancestral lands. And despite this, California Native Americans are still here and are working to steward their ancestral lands and waters. And I do just want to note that settler colonialism is not something that just happened in the past. While we are faced with the legacy of historical settler colonialism, it is an ongoing process with ongoing effects. So, recognizing that settler colonialism created massive social and environmental injustices, as well as the fact that Indigenous stewardship of ecosystems creates broader social and ecological benefits, my work broadly focuses on centering the rights, access, and decision-making of California Native American tribes in coastal management, primarily with a focus on food systems, ecosystem restoration, and policy. So this is where aquaculture comes in. Aquaculture is the cultivation of aquatic species, typically for food, and aquaculture methods have been part of Indigenous stewardship for at least thousands of years. Some great examples of this include ancient clam gardens in the Pacific Northwest and fish ponds in Hawaii. So considering this, the way that I'm thinking about aquaculture includes anything from more intensive land-based and commercial methods, which you can see on the left, to the stewardship and restoration of wild shellfish beds and indigenous forms of aquaculture, such as clam gardens. Aquaculture can also be done for a variety of purposes or goals, and one of these can be for restoration. Aquaculture really is a promising tool to support the restoration of wild populations of species that are both culturally and ecologically important. And at the same time, it can be a tool to restore Indigenous relationships and access to the coast and to these species. My work has focused specifically on shellfish, things like abalone, oysters, and clams, because they're easy to cultivate, they are nutritious, and there are many species that are both culturally and ecologically important. And so I had two main parts of what I worked on under this umbrella of Indigenous-led shellfish aquaculture. The first included learning hands-on aquaculture skills, which then transitioned into my research focused on policy. And I will be telling you a little bit about both of these today. So the first part of what I worked on for my capstone is a project that I got involved in about a year ago in the Elkhorn Slough, which is using aquaculture to restore native Olympia oysters. And I don't know how many of you know this, but there's one species of native oyster to the west coast of California, and it's probably not the one you've eaten if you've ever had oysters at a restaurant. Olympia oysters aren't usually commercially grown because they are smaller and slower to grow than the Pacific oyster, which is from Japan and the one that you usually find at restaurants. But Olympias are our one native oyster, and unfortunately, they have been in decline for over the last 100 years, especially so in Central California. This is for reasons such as overharvesting and the degradation of its habitat, which is the case for Elkhorn Slough, where European-style agriculture really transformed the slough and created a lot of really deep mud. The oyster population has been declining in the slough to the point where it was determined that we were likely going to lose oysters if we did not take action. This would have been a huge tragedy, as oysters provide nursery habitat for many marine organisms. They filter huge amounts of water, they can reduce wave energy, and so they can be part of mitigating sea level rise and erosion, and they are culturally significant. So we really did not want to lose them. Dr. Kirstine Wasson has been leading this work in Elkhorn Slough for over a decade, and around 2018, Kirstine started this project to use aquaculture to support the restoration of Olympia oysters in partnership with Moss Landing Marine Labs. These are some of the folks that I've had the pleasure of working with and learning from on this project. Dr. April Ridlin is my faculty co-advisor for my capstone project, and Dr. Luke Gardner is an additional advisor on my project. And so I want to show you just a little of what this process looks like. Wild broodstock are brought in from the slough to the lab at Moss Landing, where they are conditioned to spawn. Their larvae or their little babies are taken care of until they're ready to settle, at which point they're usually settled on shells that are collected directly from the slough, or on ground up pieces of shell called culch, which creates these more single looking oysters in that photo on the right. And once they are big and strong enough, they are outplanted or put back into the slough, where they are monitored periodically. And being part of this stage in the process has been really amazing. These stages are an opportunity for community members to get involved, including Amamutsun tribal band members. So this really has been an opportunity for tribal members to reconnect to their lands and ancestral foods in Elkhorn Slough. In this photo in the center, tribal members measured the growth and survival of some 1-year-old oysters in the slough. And the tribe is going to continue to be more deeply involved in this project in the years to come. I also learned so much from being part of this project. I gained hands-on and theoretical knowledge about aquaculture and doing restoration, things like general husbandry in the lab, best practices to protect genetic diversity when culturing wild shellfish, and some methods for monitoring outplanted oysters. I also learned about some of the barriers to doing coastal stewardship faced by the Amamutsun, and the value of Indigenous stewardship and values in projects such as these. Because of these conservation aquaculture efforts, we have learned a lot about Olympia oysters in the slough, and so far we have seen successful restoration, which is really exciting. So Elkhorn Slough and the Amamutsun tribal band are one example of how aquaculture can be used as a tool both for the restoration of species and for the restoration of Indigenous relationships. And aquaculture for conservation or restoration is fairly new in California, as is tribal leadership and involvement in projects such as these. So with this hands-on experience that I gained, I shaped my capstone to focus on identifying policies to better support tribes who are interested in pursuing native shellfish aquaculture in California. And I will say, while I focused on shellfish, this has included some seaweed too. So one other example of how aquaculture can be a tool for restoration is abalone. Abalone are an iconic part of kelp forest ecosystems and are very culturally important to tribes in California. However, because of commercial overharvest in the 20th century and intensifying climate change impacts to kelp forests, abalone populations have declined in California to the point where the California Department of Fish and Wildlife closed the recreational fishery to harvest in 2017. With this, tribes lost access to legally harvested wild abalone, and while you can purchase them from farms, they are quite expensive. So tribally owned abalone farms present an opportunity for tribes to regain both access and control over these culturally important species, and are also an opportunity for tribes to lead conservation efforts for these species. And this is exactly what my Capstone partner is doing. So I've been working with Dr. Dan Sweezy, who is a scientist with the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians. And the Kashaya have been working for the last few years to start their own red abalone farm, both for food and to raise abalone to outplant on the North Coast to support wild abalone conservation. While this is a really exciting opportunity, there are many barriers to doing aquaculture in California, especially in the permitting and the regulatory space. And so this is where my project has fit in. My research has looked at identifying barriers and opportunities for tribal aquaculture in California with a focus on policy. And a large part of my work has been looking to Washington State, where there is lots of tribal shellfish aquaculture going on, and it has been going on for a long time. So it is a good place to pull lessons learned that can possibly be applied to California. I've also interviewed tribes in California who are actively pursuing or interested in shellfish aquaculture to hear what their vision and needs are for these projects. Part of my research has also really involved thinking about how aquaculture fits into these broader conversations going on in California right now about Indigenous-led stewardship and co-management, which is the sharing of decision-making about ecosystem management between tribal and state governments. I am still analyzing my data, but there are some themes that have emerged so far. A big one is that long-term collaboration that is based on trust and respect between tribal governments and the state government is essential, and there is a lot that is needed around this in California. In conversations with California tribal members, a huge need that has emerged is having the state government and non-native entities not just acknowledge Indigenous practices, but respect Indigenous ways of knowing to the same degree that Western science is respected, and support the implementation of Indigenous science in coastal management. This includes supporting forms of stewardship that tribes want to pursue, such as aquaculture projects that have benefits for tribal communities and also have ecological and conservation benefits. In Washington, one key condition that has facilitated this long-term relationship building is that they have a legal mandate for the state and tribal governments to share the management of wild shellfish. Having this legal mandate has been really key in forming the basis of respectful long-term collaborations in Washington, and this kind of legal mandate is not something we have in California. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the legal and policy differences between Washington and California when it comes to federal Indian law, but with the lack of legal basis for co-management and this need for long-term relationship building, I do have a few recommendations for how to start building this foundation that is needed for these relationships. First, having mutual respect, trust, and an understanding of the differences between Western and Indigenous worldviews is absolutely key. And from what I heard from the California tribal staff and members who I spoke to, this is currently lacking. Considering this, one of my key recommendations is that non-native entities, including state agencies like the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and also nonprofits and researchers who might want to partner with tribes, really need to prioritize increasing education and cultural competency for their staff. I've listed some main education areas that emerged from the interviews I did, which unfortunately I don't have time to go into right now, but please ask me at the end if you would like to learn more. One other key recommendation that came out of the interviews I did with folks both in Washington State and California is that opportunities for tribal nations to collaborate and work together is one of the most exciting and beneficial aspects of this work for tribes. Cross-tribal collaboration and knowledge sharing can deepen cultural connections and identity and be very empowering. And so opportunities for this should be created and supported. Finally, an incredibly important aspect of all this is that tribes need to regain access and control over their ancestral territories, and so returning land to tribes needs to be a priority. Thinking about the impact and the lessons learned of this work, first and foremost, this research has been for two audiences. First and foremost, for tribes. My goal has been to serve their needs and priorities to the best of my ability. I will be creating recommendations and resources for them based on my work. And I will be also creating policy recommendations for California natural resources agencies. And while I think it's important to think about the tangible deliverables from projects like these, I have been reminded recently that the process and the how of projects like these really is also a major impact on everyone involved. And I know that this has been true in my experience. The relationship building, the conversations, the lessons that emerge from those conversations, and how this changes individuals, communities, and future directions is the impact. And like I said, I know that this has been really true for me. I have learned so much through this process and through the conversations and the connections that I've made. This project has really greatly deepened my understanding of the history of California and gaps in our understanding of how to best take care of the places that we live and the ecosystems that we rely on, especially in the face of climate change. It is really clear that Indigenous practices need to be part of this, but there is so much relationship building and decolonization and anti-racist work that really needs to be done on both individual and institutional levels within California. So after graduation, which for me will be in August, I intend to continue this work in California to broadly support Indigenous coastal stewardship and environmental justice and conservation. I actually have started working part-time for the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, which is a marine conservation nonprofit, on a project in support of the Tribal Marine Stewards Network, which is an alliance of 5 tribes from up and down the California coast. And I'm really excited to expand my role at CMSF in the future. So with that, I want to say a huge, huge thank you to all of the people up here and also not listed up here who have been part of this. All this work I just talked about and everything I have learned through this program would not be without all of the folks listed here. I truly feel like a collaborator on all of this work, and I'm so grateful for all these people and animals who have taught me so much and really helped me sift through the experiences and the knowledge that I've gained to really make sense of it all. So thank you. And with that, I will happily take any questions, and please feel free to contact me.